What did you learn about human nature watching the world for the last 3 months and the whole, COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown, everything? What have you seen?
Well, a lot of things that I wrote about in the book have been confirmed. Um, the first chapter in the laws of human nature, law number one, is about irrationality. And the idea is that we like to think of us human beings as being supremely rational, that our behavior is governed by our minds, by our intelligence, that we think before we act. And I try to make the point in the book, I try to hit you over the head with this idea that that's not true at all, that we're basically governed by emotions. And I explain the neuroscience behind that, how emotions are much more powerful physically than anything that our neocortex can supply to counter that. So basically, we think that our decisions are based on thinking, but they're based on our emotional responses to events. And the coronavirus is kind of a laboratory of that kind of phenomenon, because facing something so large and so immediate and so drastic, it naturally feeds our irrational tendencies. And we see that in obvious behavior, which, at least in the United States, with the hoarding of toilet paper, of hand sanitizers, of things like that, that kind of behavior was completely irrational. What was that based on? But also, people have, at least here, they have a hard time figuring out what the future is going to be. And so the fear response is very real. We have to, realize that this threat is dangerous, and that the coronavirus is something very real. But what are the long-term consequences on our thinking patterns? How is this fear going to become like a habit? How is this going to infiltrate our career decisions moving forward? You know, um, so that's one sort of thing that is definitely brought out. And it's asking. We're an intensely social animal. Our survival, I make this point in the book, depends on our ability to get along with other people and to understand their point of view, etc. And a virus like this is putting a big kind of strain on that, because what it means is, by following certain guidelines that have been put out by people who study this, scientists who actually have a more rational take on what's actually going on, like epidemiologists, the pro-social thing is to protect other people as well. So it's not just about you taking, certain steps to protect yourself, but it's also helping other people. So in some sense, there's been some positive elements, at least in parts of the states where I live, where most people are following these rules and they're thinking about other people. But there's a lot of very selfish behavior and people kind of going crazy and getting very restless about the lockdown. I often think about World War II, and in the States and certainly in Britain, of the incredible sacrifices that we were asked to make for those events, economically, personally, with our freedoms, etc. And that how people back then, there were maybe even some grumbling, but people back then were more than willing to make those sacrifices. And I'm wondering if it's the same situation now, because you're seeing people are so restless. They have to get out. They have to have their life as it was before. And if we see a second wave of this again, as might be happening right now in the United States, that means that we're not willing to make those kind of we can't even take 3 or 4 months to stay alone in our apartments or our houses to sort of let this pass over. This is another element of human nature that I sort of discuss in the book.
Just that thought of sacrifice, you're saying, or being alone. Which one do you mean? Sacrifice or just being alone with your thoughts?
Well, both. I mean, in theory, this could be a moment of great opportunity for people, because most of the time in our day-to-day lives, we're so rushed. We don't have any time to think about ourselves, to think about our careers, to think about ourselves, about who we are. We don't really have time to read books. Life just comes at us so rapidly. And here now, we have the ability to finally look at ourselves and introspect a little bit and think about who we are, think about our career, the point we are in life, to read books, to strengthen ourselves from within, because some of these life skills, the ability, for instance, to delay instant gratification. So you can't go out to a pub, you can't get drunk, etc. But you can find pleasures and distractions in other ways. And in doing that, you build a kind of inner strength that will last long after this coronavirus is gone. You'll be able to be more patient. You'll be able to withstand moments where you do have to be alone, where you do have to think, where you do have to think about yourself and what you want and what your likes and dislikes are. So the ability to be alone and to kind of reflect is a very important life skill, you know, and not just be constantly on social media, etc., and sort of have some sense of who you are as differentiating yourself from the crowd. So these are moments where you can develop true life skills. And that is a bit of a sacrifice because, you know, you're not used to having to do that in your day-to-day life, and this is sort of forcing you on it. But I want people to think of that as an actual opportunity to kind of build internal strength.
Yeah, I kept thinking because we're in London, we're in East London, and I kept thinking of 1940 Battle of Britain. I mean, this place was being bombed, on a nightly basis. People were having to sacrifice and be rationed, and they thought maybe the Germans were going to come to the shores, and they were preparing for that. So for me, I'm always when the lockdown hit and the pandemic, I just tried to compare it with something this city went through, 80 years ago, and it never seemed that bad, even though it was different because it was this invisible thing. But I always try to use that to ground me while I've been here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and the public spirit, I mean, it is a little bit of a cliche in all the movies that they have about this, particularly at certain holidays in England, but there was definitely an incredible spirit that came up, a sort of a social spirit of we're in this together, we're united, and we're going to defeat this enemy. It's a lot harder with something that's not we can't personify. It's not a living thing. It's not something that we can say this is the enemy and we're going to destroy it. It's much more diabolical than that in a way. And so in that sense, it's a little more difficult than if we were facing an actual invasion. But to think of it as something that can test our ability to unify, to think of other people, to be pro-social, to think in terms of what is the greater good for our country, for the whole country, not just the wealthy, but everybody in all classes, etc. These kinds of crises, in when you build something like a bridge or a skyscraper, in order to test its strength, you simulate like a terrible earthquake or a hurricane, because only by something so drastic can you see the faults and the cracks in the structure that you've designed. And these kind of crises reveal the faults in the structures and the gaps and the potential problems in our political structures, in our individual lives, in how strong we are. So we're being tested in a way. And that's sort of how I like to look at it. In some ways, there's good news, and in some ways, there's bad news, at least here in the United States.